Good morning and welcome to another podcast, videocast, videolog. Definitely not a podcast, but whatever it is. Lately I had a introduction day with grads from our company into Agile and project management and Lean. And though we didn't have 15 hours in a row, we had rather four-ish. And that was already maybe the mistake. Trying to explain Agile, Lean, and project management, and then maybe also the theory versus the practice in our company. And unfortunately, we have more than one practice for each of these professions. Was quite a challenge. And what is usually, in hindsight, the best thing which happens in these training courses is if you are asking the people for their expectations. And each of these graduates had really a good question. The Where I usually, when I have, let's say, proper adults with work-life experience, I get different questions. Questions I got from the graduates were mostly content related. So when to choose with which method, or it's also a bit typical to ask these kinds of questions, but nevertheless, it is content driven. When I have more experienced people asking me these questions, I often get a why, what are the risks, why are you doing it, etc. And they don't ask so much about the why, they try to understand the content, which is, I think, exactly right to some extent. The why is also important, of course. And some of the why explains itself when I would answer these questions, like why are maybe, but I think the question was like, why are agile methods more efficient than waterfall? And I didn't explicitly answer that question. There was another question which is a little bit related, and that is around why do agile projects fail? Why is it related? Because efficiency means you are doing something, doesn't matter what you're doing, and you are using less resources than you could be using if you were less efficient. If you do something efficiently, you're using less resources or time, which is a resource, money, people, brain power. So you're able to do this efficiently, but it doesn't say whether what you're doing makes a lot of sense. Agile is more efficient because it has a continuous improvement cycle embedded into its methodology, in most cases at least that is. And it makes a lot of things very transparent. The way we work, what we do, a focus on the output in all, let's say, in all three mother of agile methods like Kanban, extreme programming, and Scrum is important. And I think this optimization towards the output and making the work transparent, and in a lot of cases the retrospectives, but even if they're not there, helps making these collaborative way of working amongst team members a very efficient thing. When you look in comparison to waterfall, this is my big struggle with waterfall. Whilst in one of these books behind me, so I always take this one. It's not recent, but I would assume the size roughly is. So it's a large book in terms of length and width, and then there's a lot of text in there. So it is even thicker than it looks like. So if you look at these waterfall things, you would assume that it is a complete or holistic description of what you should be doing. If that is the case, and that is, let's say, the problem with this book, if you believe this is the case, then you are missing a lot of things out. How do you make work transparent is really, really important. But waterfall methods often have the problem that they are not asking for this transparency. I remember very well the waterfall projects I was working in, and it wasn't many, to be honest, but there were definitely two larger ones, and I've observed a few others where haven't been working in, but I was, let's say, in the bigger surrounding of this project, and one common denominator is in transparency. So there is, in a waterfall project, there's always the question, what do we show to the public, and what things do we keep secret? Why would you think that keeping things secret will help? And the problem with this kind of decision is usually that there's stuff being kept, let's say, hidden. Yeah, it's not about really secrecy sometimes, but to some degree you believe that exposing completely foreigners to internal things which are happening in the project will make life harder, because you're getting questions from the outside, or it reveals maybe weaknesses you don't want to reveal at this point in time. You want to maybe give people a safe space in which they're able to work. So let's assume for a second would be done with best interest. The problem is that you are keeping stuff hidden from the outside, and that is fine, but most often, unfortunately, it is about the status of your project. Yeah, so the one thing which is being normally in your reporting, and then we come to the topic of melon reporting, because the reporting in a waterfall project is this high polished, super aligned piece of paper, this report with nice graphs, etc. Whilst the real reporting actually happens on a Kanban board. But this level of transparency is very low level, and it can be really misleading. And if you have such, and this is for a lot of reasons, yeah, it's politics, it's, as I said, safe space maybe, or false interpretation of what a safe space is. It is lack of courage. It is fear of failing, which, by the way, is one big problem we need to tackle at some point here, failure culture. But there are tons of reasons, and none of them are good. When you're in an Agile implementation, you go with the opposite. Atlassian, I think, I can't replicate it 100%, but they have a codex or a motto of brutal honesty or something along these lines. I don't know whether we need to be brutal and then just be transparent about the stuff we do, and really show what we're working on a task board. And as soon as this happens, we start to embrace failure, because it's openly visible when things don't work. We start to embrace that being transparent about what is hindering us on progressing helps us getting momentum on things. We start not to lose fear, but we maybe start to fear the right things. Yeah, so rather than being told off or being afraid that someone would judge us based on our progress as individuals or as groups, rather focus on true problems. And only then, only if we have this openness and transparency, when we start talking about the elephants in the room or the very obvious, let's say, misbehavior of tasks on a Kanban board, if they are crowding one of our lanes more than others or columns, only then we will realize when our flow is disrupted, when our way of working doesn't really work. And only then we are able to optimize, and only then we are able to actually get the efficiency we need. And this is, in a nutshell, the reason why Agile is, if you want to ask the question, I mean, Agile more efficient, it enables efficiency and it enables optimization, and it comes in with normally with a built-in continuous improvement cycle. And this is where our Agile methodologies help. Agile, if you would take it from a different angle, if you would take it from the Agile Manifesto angle, is Agile more efficient? Probably yes, because in waterfall world, the most important thing at the beginning is the documentation. I've just today like in last week, in our company, a big project is running, and there's a third party helping us, and they have a contract in place which sort of binds them to the delivery, and the delivery is described by the documentation. So the documentation is, contractually and financially speaking, the most important part of this project. If the documentation is right, then the scope can be correctly described. If the scope can be correctly described, you can describe also the amount of effort which goes in, which then gives you a timeline, which gives you a price. And money at the end of the day is quite important. So this is how this contract is being made up. And this is also how the delivery is being made up. So first you're describing all these things in a documentation, and who would describe this stuff if not the third party? Because the third party will be held responsible for all the things. So they will talk to the end user, they'll describe in a documentation what the delivery is about, and then later on they'll give it to the internal employees, the IT people and whoever, and these internal people will then deliver actually upon the documentation, upon a conversation which has been done between a third party and someone they don't know, which is the end user, but they don't know them. That's also a nature of this project. But even if they would know them, it wouldn't help, because they wouldn't be part of the conversation and they wouldn't write the documentation. So putting working software over comprehensive documentation, putting customer interaction or collaboration and over contract negotiation. So making sure that if you do the first thing, working software over comprehensive documentation, you would shortcut the process, you would nip it in the butt, basically, as the English say, when it comes to making a big upfront documentation analysis phase, which has the typical Chinese whispering effects, that someone talks to someone and this someone then talks to this someone, and then they write something down which they believe is the full description of this requirement, and then they give it to a different person, to a third person who has never been in such a conversation before. And it might be also with a timely delay in terms of, you don't give it to him the next day, but you give it to him a month later. By that, the time, the information has aged already. So yeah, so this is what basically happens there. And in Scrum, you would try to deliver a working piece of software by then already. you wouldn't start the work, you would have delivered something already, or you would have tried at least. So you wouldn't be able to write this very long documentation, because you would need to start early, and you would need to find a different way how to measure the contract scope and size, and you would need to find a different way of mitigating risk. So here we go. An agile working software over comprehensive documentation would be one thing. You would also ask yourself, why am I writing the documentation? Yeah, you could ask, if I'm writing the complete documentation today because it is something we need to do because an auditor tells us that this is how it should run, it would at least satisfy a purpose, which is beyond, or maybe let's say embedded a little bit within the purpose of the overall project. Yeah, so there is this activity which is running. It has various stakeholders and customers. One of them may be the auditors, and they might say, you need to have this in place. I would of course challenge them and say, we can build this also, but once we have built it, we can also build the documentation alongside whilst we're building it. We don't necessarily need to build the documentation up front, and probably they would say, we don't care. That's at least my experience with auditors on projects. So if the only reason to make this documentation part before the project is to satisfy contractual things, to mitigate the risk, again, failure culture, of failing with the project and putting it up on a third party, it doesn't help. None of the two things help the end user. And we know from experience that building documentation upfront in the way I'm describing, with one person talking to the other person, but these two people never really interact with the end user, so with the developer or the development team. So we know that this doesn't help the user, and the user isn't helped by the documentation as well. It is maybe nice for him to look at and reflect on what he really wants, but this is something we can do with user stories as well on a delivery pipeline. So working software over comprehensive documentation really helps focusing on what the user and what is actually adding value to the company. And the next thing is, of course, this customer collaboration topic. So, of course, if you're discussing things with the user, in my previous example, maybe this analyst and the user are talking, they write it jointly down, or the analyst probably writes it down and the user reviews the documentation and says, yes, that's fine. There is an ultimate, how do you say that? It feels like a box. Yeah, you're taking a box, you put this documentation in, the box is open, you ask the user to review, user reviews it, then the box gets sealed. And this is your fixed scope. Unfortunately, this makes two things happen. On the one hand, the user will put in as much possible functionality in as imaginable, because he knows this is a sealed box. So once his requirements are put inside, he can't open the box again. He can't mend it, he can't change it, he can't remove or add something. It is an infinite state. And yeah, that means you will put everything in there, even if some of the stuff is nice to have or potentially required or never required, but maybe could be potentially with a 1% chance. And some of the stuff is super crucial. And this drives this behavior. So you will get much more requirements into this box than maybe are from a, let's call it, minimal viable product, yeah, required. And the other thing is, the whole organization will refrain from touching this box again in the project. I mean, the project organization, because for them the sealed box is something they can size. They'll put it on a balance, they'll weigh it. It will be £4.50, and it'll cost that amount of money to build, and they'll put it into the contract. And if someone says, I want to touch it, I want to amend something, add something, they will say, oh, that needs to go through a change management process. It'll be quite costly to change stuff now. So customer interaction, actually I need to look it up. Is it customer interaction or customer collaboration? Agile manifesto. Here we go. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So here we go. So that's, and this is actually something which makes things more efficient. It makes it also more effective. I mean, responding to change over following a plan follows pretty much the same pattern. And the first one, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Yeah, I mean, this process of a sealed box, just as an example, this is set in stone. This will be very hard to overcome. Yeah, so it's definitely not breathing this. All right, gents, I think this is more than enough. We have 22 minutes on the clock. I wish you a very productive day, and maybe you take this, I will definitely take this revelation on again, or this reminder that people who are asking questions, they're really, these questions are a good content filler in terms of, why do we do the things? Because when I am into this agile shit long enough, and I definitely am, so I'm thinking about it for a very long time, I don't take these things, I don't need to think about them any longer. For me, it's crystal clear. There's just one way of doing it, and it's this particular way. I'm, let's say, also a bit stubborn or fixed in my path. And I get more fixed on it when these questions come along, and I think I can pretty much mitigate all the problems in software development, project management with an agile approach. That's why I'm still a fanboy. So have a